They called her the Moretti family's biggest mistake. When Dandre Moretti, the ruthless heir to the city's most brutal crime syndicate, was forced to marry Bridget Gallagher to settle a blood debt. The underworld laughed. She was heavily overweight, painfully quiet, and lacked the razor-sharp glamour of a mafia wife. The socialites mocked her, the capos openly disrespected her. But what they failed to realize was that Bridget's silence was never rooted in fear. It was an assessment. Every insult was filed, every threat was calculated, and one by one, every single enemy who dared to lay a finger on the unwanted Chubby bride simply ceased to exist. The cathedral smelled of suffocating white lilies and unspoken contempt. 200 of the most dangerous, influential figures on the eastern seaboard sat in the polished oak pews, their designer suits and tailored dresses hiding holstered weapons and generational malice. At the altar stood Dandre Moretti, tall, sculpted from a lineage of Sicilian violence and radiating a cold, furious energy. He did not want to be here. He did not want the woman walking down the aisle. Bridget Gallagher moved with a slow, deliberate pace. Her wedding gown, a custom piece hastily commissioned by her terrified father, Thomas Gallagher, struggled to flatter her plus-sized figure. The heavy ivory silk clung awkwardly to her wide hips and thick waist, a stark contrast to the impossibly thin, surgically enhanced women who populated the Moretti Empire. As she walked, the whispers rippled through the pews like a venomous current. "She looks like a stuffed pastry," one capo's wife muttered behind a lace fan. "I give it 3 months before Dandre puts a bullet in her himself," another whispered. Bridget heard them all. Her round face, framed by dark, heavy curls, remained entirely impassive. Her soft hazel eyes stared straight ahead, locking onto Dandre's icy glare. She knew exactly why she was here. Her father had gambled away $5 million of the Moretti cartel's money. The only way Don Carmine Moretti Dandre's aging traditionalist father agreed to spare Thomas's life was to absorb the Gallagher's legitimate shipping ports through a blood union. Bridget was the sacrificial lamb, the collateral. When her father handed her off at the altar, Dandre didn't even offer his hand. He simply turned to the priest, his jaw tight. "Let's get this over with," Dandre muttered loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. Throughout the ceremony, Bridget did not shed a tear. She did not blush. She repeated her vows in a voice so soft and flat it barely registered over the cathedral's acoustics. When the priest instructed Dandre to kiss the bride, he leaned in his lips, barely brushing the corner of her cheek, his body rigid with revulsion. The reception was held at the Grand Moretti estate, an opulent fortress overlooking the city harbor. It was less of a celebration and more of a public display of Bridget's humiliation. She was left entirely alone at the head table. Dandre had immediately abandoned her to drink scotch with his underbosses, laughing at jokes she knew were at her expense. Bridget sat quietly, her plate of roasted pheasant untouched. She watched. That was what Bridget did best. Growing up as the forgotten, overweight daughter of an alcoholic shipping magnate, she had learned early on that being invisible was a superpower. People ignored the fat girl in the corner. They spoke freely around her. They revealed their secrets, their affairs, their weaknesses, assuming she was too dim or too intimidated to understand. She watched Dandre's cousin, Leo Moretti, eyeing the Don's chair with naked ambition. She watched the family's chief accountant sweating profusely as he checked his phone. And she watched Chloe Sterling Dandre's longtime mistress, a slender, striking blonde who looked like she belonged on the cover of Vogue, glaring daggers at her from across the ballroom. Eventually, Chloe, fueled by champagne and arrogance, sauntered up to the head table. She leaned in close to Bridget, her perfume a suffocating cloud of jasmine and malice. "Enjoy the dress, sweetheart." Chloe sneered, her manicured nails tapping the table. "It's the only time you'll ever get to play dress-up. Dandre will be in my bed by midnight. You're just a tax write-off in a tent." Bridget slowly turned her head. She looked Chloe up and down, her expression infuriatingly blank. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just offered a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Have a pleasant evening, Chloe," Bridget said softly. Chloe scoffed, tossing her blonde hair as she marched away victorious. She had put the fat bride in her place. But as Bridget watched Chloe walk away, a faint, chilling smile touched the corners of her lips. Beneath the heavy silk of her dress, her fingers traced the smooth screen of a heavily encrypted satellite phone hidden in her pocket. Bridget Gallagher was a lot of things. Unwanted, overweight, silent. But she was also the sole architect of the Nightingale Network, a shadow syndicate of fixers, hackers, and cleaners that even the Morettis didn't know existed. And she had just marked her first target. The morning after the wedding, the sprawling master bedroom of the Moretti estate was deathly quiet. Dandre had indeed not come home. Bridget woke alone in the massive four-poster bed. She didn't feel heartbroken. She felt efficient. She dressed in a simple tailored black dress that she had bought herself, rejecting the gaudy, flashy clothes her father had packed for her. As she descended the sweeping marble staircase, the household staff gave her a wide berth, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disdain. The cook slammed a plate of dry toast and black coffee in front of her without a word. Bridget ate quietly, scrolling through an encrypted data stream on her tablet. That evening, a mandatory charity gala hosted by the mayor required the newlyweds' attendance. It was a crucial event for the Moretti family's legitimate fronts. Dandre arrived at the estate just 20 minutes before they were due to leave. He reeked of Chloe's jasmine perfume. "Don't speak unless spoken to," Dandre ordered as they sat in the back of the armored Maybach. He didn't even look at her. "You represent my family now. Try not to embarrass me." "I understand," Bridget replied, her voice steady. The gala was a glittering sea of diamonds and hypocrisy. As soon as they arrived, Dandre abandoned her again, disappearing into a private VIP lounge with city politicians. Bridget stood near a massive ice sculpture, nursing a glass of sparkling water. It didn't take long for the hyenas to circle. Chloe Sterling, flanked by two other socialites, practically swaggered over. Chloe was wearing a slinky red dress that left little to the imagination. She was furious that Bridget was standing there, holding the title of Mrs. Moretti, a title Chloe believed was rightfully hers. "You really have no shame, do you?" Chloe said loudly, drawing the attention of several nearby guests. Standing around the buffet table, making sure nobody else gets any of the caviar. The socialites giggled. Bridget remained perfectly still. "I haven't eaten anything, Chloe," Bridget said mildly. "Well, you look like you have," Chloe snapped, stepping closer, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, spiteful light. "You don't belong here. You are a disgusting, pathetic joke. Dandre told me this morning that he can't even stand to look at you." To maximize the humiliation, Chloe accidentally stumbled forward. The full glass of dark Pinot Noir in her hand splashed directly onto Bridget's chest, staining the expensive black fabric with a dark, sticky red patch. Gasps echoed from the onlookers. The music seemed to stop. Everyone waited for the new mafia wife to burst into tears and flee. Bridget looked down at the stain. Then she looked up at Chloe. The absolute deadness in Bridget's eyes made Chloe take an involuntary step backward. A sudden chill swept through the blonde woman's spine. "You seem a little unsteady, Chloe," Bridget said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "You really should be careful. The roads out there are very treacherous at night. People get lost all the time." "Are you threatening me, you fat cow?" Chloe hissed, trying to regain her bravado. Bridget pulled a white silk handkerchief from her clutch, dabbed gently at her dress, and smiled. "Just wishing you a safe journey home." Dandre materialized from the crowd, his face flushed with anger when he saw the scene. He grabbed Bridget's arm, his grip bruising. "We are leaving. Now." He dragged her out of the ballroom, leaving Chloe smirking in triumph. In the car ride home, Dandre berated Bridget for 10 minutes, straight accusing her of provoking Chloe and making him look like a fool. Bridget stared out the dark window, watching the city lights blur by. She let him scream. At 2:14 a.m., Bridget sat in the dark of her separate bedroom. She opened her secure phone and typed a single message to a contact named Arthur, "The Jasmine needs pruning." 10 seconds later, a reply blinked on the screen. "Understood. Roots and all." The next morning, the city awoke to chaos. Chloe Sterling was missing. It wasn't a standard kidnapping. There was no ransom note. There was no sign of a struggle. Her luxury penthouse was completely untouched. Her Pomeranian was sleeping peacefully on the sofa. Her makeup was still laid out on the vanity. The only thing out of place was her red dress from the night before, neatly folded at the foot of her bed, washed completely clean of the wine stain. Dandre tore the city apart. He ordered his enforcers to shake down every rival gang, every petty thief, every debt collector who might have had a grudge. For 3 days, the Moretti Syndicate turned the underworld upside down. Nothing. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed Chloe whole. On the 4th day, Dandre sat in his study, exhausted, nursing a glass of bourbon. Bridget walked in quietly, carrying a tray with fresh ice and a plate of cured meats. She'd set it down on his desk without making a sound. Dandre looked up at her. For the first time, he really looked at her. Her face was serene, placid, untouched by the panic that was tearing his organization apart. "Do you know something about this?" Dandre asked, his voice low, laced with a sudden, unexplainable paranoia. Bridget paused, her hand resting on the silver ice tongs. She met his gaze directly. "I know that the world is a very large place, Dandre," she said softly. "And sometimes people who take up too much space simply slip through the cracks." She turned and walked out of the study, leaving Dandre staring at the empty doorway, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. The sudden absolute erasure of Chloe Sterling sent shockwaves through the Moretti family. It wasn't just that she was missing, it was the horrifying perfection of her disappearance. No blood, no witnesses, no digital footprint. The police had already classified it as a voluntary disappearance, citing a supposed sudden trip abroad, backed by a perfectly forged flight manifest and passport scan that popped up on their servers. But the underworld knew better. Someone had taken a ghost and made it real. While Dandre was distracted by the loss of his mistress and the sudden vulnerability of his security, his ambitious cousin, Leo Moretti, saw an opening. Leo was a man built of pure, unadulterated greed. He had been skimming from the family's underground casinos for 2 years, funneling millions into an offshore account in the Caymans. With Dandre emotionally compromised, Leo decided it was time to make his move for the throne. But he needed a scapegoat to take the fall for the missing casino funds before the family's auditors caught on. He needed someone disposable, someone nobody liked. He chose Bridget. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sprawling gardens of the Moretti estate were bathed in golden sunlight. Bridget was sitting on a wrought-iron bench near the rose bushes, reading a heavy leather-bound book on Byzantine history. She wore a loose, comfortable emerald-green dress, blending into the lush foliage. Leo swaggered down the gravel path, flanked by 2 of his personal enforcers, hulking men with broken noses and tailored suits. Leo grinned, revealing a gold-capped tooth. He lit a cigar, blowing the smoke directly into Bridget's face as he approached. "Reading up on dead empires, B?" Leo chuckled, stepping uncomfortably close. "Fitting." Bridget didn't look up from her book. She slowly turned a page. "Can I help you, Leo?" "Actually, you can," Leo said, his tone turning sharp and menacing. He pulled a folded stack of ledger printouts from his inside pocket and tossed them onto her lap. "The family accountants are doing a surprise audit tomorrow. They're going to find a $3 million hole in the casino accounts." Bridget glanced at the papers, then finally looked up at Leo. And they're going to trace the routing numbers directly to a dummy corporation set up under your maiden name, Gallagher. Leo smiled a cruel, predatory expression. "Your father's a known degenerate gambler. It makes perfect sense. The fat, resentful bride stealing from the family to pay off her daddy's hidden debts." Bridget's expression didn't change. She didn't panic. She didn't defend herself. She looked at the forged documents, noting the amateurish way the shell company was structured. "You made a mistake, Leo," Bridget said quietly. Leo laughed loudly, looking back at his enforcers who joined in the chuckling. "Oh yeah, what's that pork chop?" "You routed the funds through a bank in Cyprus," Bridget stated, closing her book. "But you didn't mask the IP address of the initial transfer. You did it from the VIP room of your own club. At 3:14 a.m. last Thursday." The laughter died in Leo's throat. The color drained from his face. "How the hell do you know that?" Bridget stood up. Even though Leo was taller, the sheer, immovable weight of her presence suddenly felt suffocating. The air around them seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I am a very quiet person, Leo," Bridget said, taking a slow step toward him. "When you are quiet, you hear everything. I know about the skimming. I know about the Caymans. I know you plan to assassinate Dandre at the docks this Friday." Leo's hand instinctively went to the gun, holstered under his jacket. His enforcers tensed, reaching for their weapons. "You crazy bitch!" Leo breathed, his eyes darting around the empty garden. "I'll kill you right here. I'll tell Dandre you confessed to the theft and pulled a weapon on me." Bridget didn't flinch. She just stared at him with those deep, void-like, hazel eyes. "You won't kill me, Leo," Bridget said softly, "because if you pull that gun, the sniper currently aiming at the base of your skull from the South Tower will turn your head into a red mist before your finger even touches the trigger. And his 2 friends will do the same to your guards." Leo froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. He slowly, agonizingly turned his head toward the South Tower of the estate. He couldn't see anything through the glare of the sun, but he felt the crosshairs. A cold sweat drenched his silk shirt. "You're bluffing," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. "Take a step toward me and find out," Bridget challenged, her voice a velvety whisper of death. Leo didn't move. The 2 enforcers beside him swallowed hard, their hands slowly moving away from their jackets. "You have 24 hours to put the money back," Bridget instructed, picking up her book. "If you do, you get to keep your life, and you will leave this city forever. If you don't," she let the sentence hang in the warm summer air. Bridget turned and walked back toward the mansion, her heavy footfalls crunching softly on the gravel. Leo didn't put the money back. His pride wouldn't let an unwanted, chubby bride dictate terms to him. That night, he gathered his most loyal men and prepared to strike the estate, intent on wiping out both Dandre and Bridget in one bloody coup. He never made it out of his compound. The next morning, Dandre was jolted awake by the frantic ringing of his cell phone. It was his underboss. Leo's heavily guarded compound had been breached. But there was no gunfire. No alarms had been tripped. The 20 armed guards patrolling the perimeter had woken up blindfolded and zip-tied to the front gates with absolutely no memory of how they got there. And Leo was gone. Dandre drove to the compound himself, pushing his Maybach to over 100 miles an hour. When he burst into Leo's private office, the room was immaculate. The safe was open, entirely empty. The offshore accounts had been completely drained, the money anonymously donated to 7 different orphanages across the state. On the center of Leo's heavy mahogany desk sat a small velvet jewelry box. Dandre approached it with shaking hands. He popped the lid open. Inside was Leo's signature gold and ruby pinky ring. It was still attached to the severed pinky finger. Tucked beneath the finger was a crisp white card with elegant cursive handwriting. He took up too much space. Dandre stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He remembered Bridget's words from the study days ago. People who take up too much space simply slip through the cracks. He drove back to the estate in a daze. The hierarchy of the city's underworld was shattering, and the phantom dismantling it was living under his roof. He walked into the grand dining room. Bridget was sitting at the head of the long table this time, calmly eating a slice of cherry pie. She looked up as Dandre entered. He looked terrified. For the first time in his brutal, violent life, Dandre Moretti realized he was entirely outmatched. "How was your morning, Dandre?" Bridget asked, wiping a crumb from the corner of her mouth. Dandre stared at the woman he had humiliated, the woman he had ignored, the unwanted, chubby bride. Who are you?" He finally whispered, his voice cracking. Bridget took a slow sip of her coffee. The silence stretched heavy and lethal. "I'm your wife," she smiled, "and I think it's time we finally talked about our future." The dining room of the Moretti estate was dead silent, save for the soft clinking of Bridget's fork against the fine porcelain plate. Dandre stood near the doorway, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. He stared at the severed finger resting in the jewelry box he had brought back from Leo's compound, and then at the woman sitting calmly at the head of his table. "I asked you a question," Dandre said, his voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "Who are you?" Bridget dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, her hazel eyes locking onto his. There was no warmth in her gaze, but there was no malice either. It was the look of a surgeon assessing a patient on the operating table. "I am exactly who you married, Dandre," Bridget replied, her voice smooth and unbothered. "Thomas Gallagher's overweight, unwanted daughter. The punchline to your family's jokes. The woman your father forced you to take to secure the shipping ports." "Leo is gone," Dandre interrupted, stepping closer, his hands balling into fists. 50 armed men guarding his estate, and he vanishes into thin air. Chloe disappears from a locked penthouse. You sit here eating cherry pie, while my family's empire is being systematically dismantled. "Corrected," Bridget said gently. "Not dismantled. Corrected. Leo was skimming from the casinos to fund an offshore account in the Caymans. $3 million to be exact. He planned to frame me for it, and then assassinate you at the docks this Friday to take over the family. Chloe Sterling was actively selling your patrol routes to the Albanian syndicate in exchange for a cut of their weapons trafficking. They were liabilities. I simply pruned the dead branches." Dandre froze. The Albanians. The assassination plot. He had suspected a leak regarding his patrol routes for months, but could never trace it. The sheer volume of information she possessed was staggering. "How?" Dandre demanded, pulling out a chair and collapsing into it. "You've been here less than a month. You don't leave the house. You don't speak to anyone." "That is precisely how," Bridget explained, leaning forward, resting her plump arms on the mahogany table. Since I was a little girl, people have ignored me. They look at my size, my silence, and they assume I am stupid. They assume I am harmless. My father held meetings with the most dangerous men in the city in our living room. They would discuss bribes, hits, and shipments while I sat in the corner reading a book. I became a ghost in my own life. So I started listening. And more importantly, I started recording. She slid a sleek black tablet across the table toward him. Dandre looked down at the screen. It was a live feed of the city's underground financial grid, a staggering, beautifully terrifying web of encrypted data. I call it the Nightingale Network, Bridget continued, a shadow syndicate comprised of hackers, disgruntled fixers, and invisible people just like me. Maids, chauffeurs, accountants. The people who actually run this city, while men like you take the credit and the bullets. I control the information, Dandre. And in this world, information is far more lethal than a gun. Dandre stared at the screen, watching millions of dollars in illicit funds being tracked in real time. A cold realization washed over him. He wasn't married to a victim. He was married to a predator who had disguised herself as prey. "Why are you telling me this?" Dandre asked, his arrogance completely stripped away, leaving only a raw, primal caution. "You could have taken me off the board just as easily as Leo. Because a king needs a kingdom and a kingdom needs a king," Bridget said, closing the tablet. "I have no desire to sit in cigar smoke and negotiate with street thugs. I prefer the shadows. You have the name, the physical presence, the fear. You are the muscle, Dandre. But from now on, I am the brain. If we work together, the Moretti family will rule the eastern seaboard within a year. If you oppose me, you will wake up in a place where nobody will ever find you." Before Dandre could respond, his phone buzzed violently against the wood of the table. He glanced at the caller ID. It was his father, Don Carmine Moretti. Dandre answered it, putting it on speaker out of a sudden unspoken deference to his wife. "Dandre," the raspy, age-hardened voice of the Don echoed in the room. "Leo's compound is empty. Word on the street is that a ghost took him. The 5 families are getting nervous. They think we're weak. Get to my estate immediately, and bring the fat girl. We need to discuss the Gallagher ports." The line went dead. Dandre looked at Bridget. She didn't flinch at the insult. "It seems we have a family meeting," Bridget said, standing up and smoothing out her dark skirt. "Let's not keep your father waiting." An hour later, the armored Maybach pulled through the iron gates of Don Carmine's fortress. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter with assault rifles, their eyes scanning the tree line for an invisible enemy. Inside the Don's cavernous, smoke-filled study, Carmine sat behind a massive oak desk, an oxygen tube discreetly resting beneath his nose. He looked older, frailer, but his eyes were sharp and venomous. Standing beside him was a man who made Dandre's blood run cold. Victor Russo, known on the streets as the Butcher. Victor was a hulking brute of a man, his face a canvas of jagged scars from a lifetime of knife fights and brutal interrogations. He was Carmine's oldest, most vicious enforcer, a man brought in only when the Don wanted to make a public, gruesome example out of someone. "Sit," Carmine ordered, as Dandre and Bridget entered. Dandre took a seat, but Bridget remained standing, her hands clasped calmly in front of her. Victor Russo immediately sneered, looking Bridget up and down with open disgust. "Is the chair not wide enough for you, sweetheart?" Victor grunted, his voice like grinding stones. Dandre tensed, instinctively preparing to defend his wife, but a sharp, imperceptible glance from Bridget kept him in his seat. "I prefer to stand, Mr. Russo," Bridget said softly. It is better for the circulation. Carmine slammed a fist on the desk. Enough. Leo is gone. The city thinks our family is imploding. I will not have the Moretti name dragged through the mud by ghosts and rumors. We need to project absolute strength. We need to solidify our assets immediately. The Don turned his predatory gaze to Bridget. Your father Thomas is dragging his feet on signing over the final deeds to the southern shipping ports. He claims the marriage contract requires another month to mature. I am out of patience. My father is a cautious man, Don Carmine, Bridget replied smoothly. He just wants to ensure the transition is legally watertight. I don't care about the law, Carmine spat. I care about the docs. Victor, tell them the plan. Victor stepped forward, pulling a heavy combat knife from his belt and casually cleaning his nails with the tip. Tonight I take a crew down to the Gallagher estate. We bypass the legalities entirely. We put a gun to Tommy Boy's head, make him sign the transfer deeds, and then we put a bullet in his brain. We dump his body in the harbor and tell the police it was a suicide over his gambling debts. The ports become ours by default, as Dandre is married to his only heir. Dandre shot out of his chair. You can't do that. That breaks the truce we made with the Irish factions. It will start a war. Let them come, Victor roared. The Morettis don't beg for ports. We take them. Your generation is soft, Dandre. You marry the pig to get the farm. I say we just slaughter the farmer. Dandre looked at his father, pleading for reason, but Carmine's face was set in stone. The old man was terrified of losing his grip on the city, and fear made him reckless. It happens tonight, Carmine finalized. Victor handles it. Bridget, you will stay here in the guest wing until the paperwork is filed. If you try to warn your father, Victor will do to you what he's going to do to him. Bridget stood perfectly still. Her father was a drunk, a coward, and he had sold her to monsters to save his own skin. But he was still her father. And more importantly, the southern ports were the central hub for the Nightingale Network's untraceable hardware shipments. I understand, Don Carmine. Bridget said, her voice a flat, dead calm. Victor laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Good girl, go wait in your pen. As Bridget turned and walked out of the study, she reached into the deep pocket of her cardigan. Her fingers danced across the encrypted screen of her phone, navigating to a direct line to Arthur. The butcher is heading to the slaughterhouse, she typed rapidly without looking. Ready the hooks. No blood in the water. At midnight, a heavy fog rolled into the harbor, blanketing the city in a damp, suffocating grey. Victor Russo sat in the passenger seat of a black SUV, leading a convoy of 3 vehicles toward the Gallagher estate on the cliffs overlooking the sea. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He loved the old ways. He loved the fear in a man's eyes, right before the end. Kill the headlights, Victor growled to his driver as they approached the private winding road leading to Thomas Gallagher's mansion. The 3 SUVs went dark, crawling up the asphalt like massive black beetles. Victor checked his suppressed pistol, a cruel smile twisting his scarred face. He planned to make Thomas Gallagher squeal before he pulled the trigger. Sir, the driver said, his voice laced with confusion. The gate, it's already open. Victor frowned, leaning forward. Through the dense fog, he could see the massive wrought-iron gates of the Gallagher estate standing wide open. There were no guards. There were no lights on in the mansion. The entire property was completely dead. Stay sharp. Might be a trap, Victor ordered, clicking his radio. Team 2, secure the perimeter. Team 3, with me through the front door. The SUVs rolled to a halt in the circular driveway. Victor stepped out the gravel, crunching loudly beneath his heavy boots. The silence of the estate was unnatural. Even the crickets seemed to have stopped chirping. He kicked the heavy oak front door. To his surprise, it swung open, effortlessly unlatched. Tommy! Victor roared into the dark foyer, sweeping his flashlight across the grand staircase and the opulent chandeliers. Come out, Tommy! The rent is due. Only the echo of his own voice answered him. Victor and his 6 men moved through the house with tactical precision. They checked the living room, the study, the bedrooms. Nothing. The beds were unmade. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat on the desk in the study, but the house was completely devoid of human life. "Boss!" A voice crackled over Victor's radio. It was Team 2 outside. "You need to see this. Out back. By the cliff." Victor jogged through the kitchen and out the back terrace doors. The fog was thicker here, swirling aggressively off the dark ocean below. In the center of the manicured lawn sat a single massive steel shipping container. It looked entirely out of place, a rusted behemoth ruining the pristine landscape. "What the hell is this?" Victor muttered, approaching the container. The heavy steel doors of the container were slightly ajar. A faint blue light emanated from within. Victor motioned for his men to flank the doors. He raised his gun, his heart pounding a steady, violent rhythm. He reached out and yanked the heavy door open. Inside there was no ambush. There was no Thomas Gallagher. The interior of the container was retrofitted into a high-tech mobile command center. Servers hummed against the back wall, their blue and green LED lights cutting through the darkness. In the center of the container sat a single desk, and on that desk was a large, flat-screen monitor. The screen suddenly flared to life. Victor flinched, raising his gun at the monitor. On the screen was Bridget. She was sitting comfortably in what looked like the Moretti Estate's library, sipping a cup of tea. The feed was crystal clear. "Good evening, Victor." Bridget's voice echoed through hidden speakers inside the container. "You stupid bitch!" Victor snarled, lowering his gun slightly, but signaling his men to sweep the container. "Where is Tommy? What is this trick?" "My father is currently on a private jet halfway to Geneva, courtesy of a sudden, generously funded retirement plan," Bridget explained smoothly. "He will live out his days quietly. The ports are now under my direct, exclusive control. You think a screen is going to save you?" Victor laughed, though a sliver of unease began to gnaw at his gut. "I'll tear this tin can apart, and then I'm coming back to the estate to carve you up myself." "I don't think you'll have the time," Bridget said, taking a delicate sip of her tea. "You see, Victor, while you were so focused on cutting throats for Don Carmine, you were incredibly careless with your own secrets." The screen split. Next to Bridget's placid face appeared a series of scanned documents and bank statements. 7 months ago, you intercepted a shipment of pure cocaine belonging to the Sinaloa cartel at Pier 12. Bridget narrated, her voice devoid of emotion. "You told Don Carmine the feds raided it, but you kept the product, moved it through a shell company in Baltimore, and pocketed $8 million. Victor felt the blood drain from his face. His men standing behind him suddenly shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. Stealing from this cartel was a death sentence. Stealing from Don Carmine was worse. "That's a lie," Victor barked, his voice lacking its usual thunder. "Fake documents." "The cartel doesn't care much for forensic accounting, Victor," Bridget continued, "which is why 5 minutes ago I sent these documents along with the GPS coordinates of your secret stash house in Queens directly to the cartel's regional boss. And as an insurance policy, I also sent the unredacted ledgers to Don Carmine." Panic, pure and unadulterated, finally struck the butcher. He lunged toward the monitor, raising his gun to smash it. "Shut it off," he screamed. "One last thing, Victor." Bridget's voice cut through the air, freezing him in his tracks. "Your men behind you. The ones you trust with your life." Victor slowly turned his head. His 6 enforcers, the men he had trained and bled with, all had their weapons raised. But they weren't pointed at the door. They were pointed directly at him. I transferred $1 million into each of their offshore accounts exactly 10 seconds ago, Bridget stated calmly. Their instructions are very simple. The container doors close. The lock is sealed. Boys, put the guns down, Victor pleaded, holding his hands up the combat knife, suddenly feeling like a child's toy. She's playing us. Goodbye, Victor. The screen went black. Before Victor could scream, the butt of a rifle cracked hard against the back of his skull. He collapsed to the steel floor, his vision blurring, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. As he slipped into unconsciousness, the last thing he heard was the deafening clang of the heavy steel doors slamming shut, plunging him into absolute, inescapable darkness. The next morning, Don Carmine awoke to a frantic knocking on his bedroom door. It was his head of security. Carmine threw on a silk robe and hurried down to his study. Dandre was already there, pacing the floor, his face pale. "What happened?" Carmine rasped, coughing into a handkerchief. "Did Victor get the signatures?" Dandre pointed a shaking finger at the center of the Don's oak desk. Resting perfectly in the center was Victor Russo's bloody combat knife. Underneath the blade was a fresh printed copy of the bank ledgers proving Victor's theft from the family, and a printed screenshot of an email confirming that an anonymous tip had been sent to the cartel. But the final blow was the shipping manifest pinned beneath the knife. It detailed a single heavily reinforced steel container loaded onto a cargo ship bound for Bogota, Colombia. The contents were listed simply as scrap meat. Carmine staggered backward, collapsing into his heavy leather chair. He stared at the knife, his chest heaving as he struggled for oxygen. Victor Russo, his most feared weapon, a man who had survived 3 decades of gang wars, had been utterly erased in a single night without a single shot fired by the Moretti family. The study door clicked open. Bridget walked in. She was wearing a beautifully tailored dark plum dress that commanded the room. She carried a silver tray with a fresh cup of espresso and set it gently in front of Don Carmine. The old Don looked up at her, terror blooming in his milky eyes. He finally saw the phantom that was tearing his world apart. "Good morning, Don Carmine," Bridget said, her voice a gentle, chilling melody. "I reviewed the paperwork for the southern ports. The transfer is complete. I will be managing the logistics moving forward to ensure the family's security." Carmine looked at Dandre silently, begging his son for an explanation, for a way out. But Dandre just stood there, his eyes lowered to the floor in absolute submission. "Is there a problem, Don Carmine?" Bridget asked, tilting her head slightly. Carmine looked at the bloody knife, and then at the unwanted chubby bride who now held his empire by the throat. The old wolf was beaten. "No," Carmine whispered, his voice trembling as he picked up the espresso cup with shaking hands. "No problem at all. Bridget." The atmosphere within the Moretti estate shifted overnight. The terrified whispers that once mocked the unwanted chubby bride morphed into a breathless, suffocating reverence. The household staff who had previously served her cold coffee and stale toast now presented elaborate multi-course breakfasts with trembling hands. The armed guards stationed in the hallways averted their eyes when she walked past. Bridget Gallagher had not fired a single bullet, yet she had conquered the most vicious crime family on the eastern seaboard from the comfort of the dining room table. Don Carmine's health deteriorated rapidly after the loss of Victor Russo. The psychological blow of being utterly outmaneuvered by his daughter-in-law triggered a severe respiratory collapse. He was confined to his bed, hooked to oxygen machines, essentially a prisoner in his own fortress. This left Dandre as the acting head of the family. But everyone in the inner circle knew who held the leash. The abrupt disappearances of Leo Moretti and Victor Russo, however, did not go unnoticed by the outside world. The commission, the ruling body of the 5 families, smelled blood in the water. To them, the Morettis were bleeding out, weakened by internal purges, and led by a young, unproven Don. It was the perfect time to carve up their territory. A mandatory summit was called. The location was a heavily fortified neutral estate in the Hamptons, owned by a corrupt state judge on the mafia's payroll. "We are walking into an ambush," Dandre said, pacing the length of their master bedroom. He was wearing a custom Brioni suit, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "Salvatore Greco is leading the summit. He's the boss of the Lucchese faction. He's ruthless, Bridget. He's bringing his top capos. They're going to demand the southern ports and the casino revenues, or they're going to declare a street war." Bridget sat at her vanity, carefully applying a deep, matte red lipstick. She wore a heavy dark navy dress, tailored to her wide frame, draped with a stunning, understated string of South Sea pearls. She looked completely undisturbed. "Let them declare what they wish, Dandre," Bridget said, pressing her lips together. "A war requires resources. Resources require access. They have neither." "You don't understand, Greco," Dandre pleaded, stopping behind her to look at her reflection in the mirror. "He doesn't use computers. He doesn't have offshore accounts you can hack. He's old school. He deals in cash buried in the walls and loyalty bought with blood. Your Nightingale network can't touch a ghost who doesn't leave a digital footprint." Bridget finally turned around. She looked at her husband, a man who, just weeks ago, couldn't bear to touch her. Now he looked at her, as if she were the only thing keeping him alive. "Everyone leaves a footprint, Dandre," she said softly. "Some just require a different type of illumination. We are going to the Hamptons." The summit was held in a massive wood-paneled library overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. 30 heavily armed men secured the perimeter. Inside, Salvatore Greco sat at the head of a long mahogany table. Greco was a man carved from old Sicilian stone, with a graying beard and eyes like black ice. 3 other family bosses flanked him. When Dandre entered, followed quietly by Bridget, Greco didn't bother to stand. He took a slow drag from his cigar and let out a harsh, gravelly laugh. "Dandre," Greco sneered. "I heard Carmine was on his deathbed, but I didn't realize things were so bad you had to bring your wife to hold your hand. And my God, they weren't lying about the size of her. Tell me, does she double as your human shield?" The other bosses chuckled darkly. Dandre's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He opened his mouth to defend her, but Bridget gently placed a hand on his forearm, silencing him. She walked past Dandre, her heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet room, and took a seat directly opposite Greco. She didn't say a word. She simply reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a small, foil-wrapped square of dark chocolate, unwrapped it, and placed it on her tongue. "I don't do business with women." Greco spat his amusement, quickly turning to disdain. "Especially not pigs who don't know their place. Get her out of here, Dandre, before I have my men throw her off the balcony." "My wife stays," Dandre said, his voice surprisingly steady, bolstered by the terrifying calm radiating from Bridget. "Fine. Then she can listen to you surrender." Greco leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table. "Here are the terms. The Moretti family is unstable. You've lost your top enforcers. You will cede the southern shipping ports to my family effective at midnight. You will also hand over 40% of your underground casino revenue as a tax to the commission. If you refuse, we wipe you off the map by sunrise." Dandre looked at Bridget. The room waited for his answer. Bridget swallowed. The chocolate wiped her fingers on a napkin, and finally looked Greco in the eye. "Salvatore," Bridget said, her voice a soft, polite murmur that commanded absolute silence. "You are correct. You do not use banks. You do not use smartphones. You are very careful." Greco frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Who gave you permission to speak? But your wife Isabella is not so careful. Bridget continued, smoothly ignoring his threat. She enjoys the finer things. Specifically, she enjoys the private art auctions in Geneva. And your underboss, Paulie, he enjoys the high-stakes baccarat tables in Macau. What is this nonsense? One of the other bosses muttered. 2 days ago, I had the Nightingale Network cross-reference the travel logs of every person in your inner circle with international law enforcement databases. Bridget said, pulling a thin black folder from her bag and sliding it across the polished wood toward Greco. Greco didn't touch it. He just stared at her. You deal in cash, Salvatore, but your people launder it, and they are sloppy, Bridget explained, leaning back in her chair. Inside that folder are the exact coordinates of the 3 storage facilities in Brooklyn where you currently have $90 million in untraceable cartel cash sitting on wooden pallets, the money you are holding for the Juarez Syndicate. The color rapidly drained from Greco's face. He snatched the folder, flipping it open. His hands began to shake as he looked at high-resolution satellite photos and printed ledger codes. If we do not leave this room with our territory intact. Bridget whispered, the softness of her voice cutting through the tension like a straight razor. I will press one button on my phone. An anonymous tip containing this exact file will be sent to the FBI's Organized Crime Division, the DEA, and more importantly, to the Juarez cartel's Sicario network. The feds will take your freedom, Salvatore. But the cartel will take your family. They will skin your careful wife alive for losing their money. Silence descended upon the library. It was a thick, choking silence. The other bosses slowly leaned away from Greco, instantly distancing themselves from a man who was seconds away from a cartel death sentence. Greco looked at the fat, quiet woman sitting across from him. He saw no bluff in her hazel eyes. He saw only a cold, calculated abyss. You, Greco stammered, the cigar falling from his fingers onto the table. You're a monster. No, Salvatore. Bridget smiled faintly. I am just a woman who takes up a lot of space. Now I believe you were just telling my husband that the Commission recognizes the Moretti family's exclusive claim to the southern ports. Isn't that right? Greco swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked at his fellow bosses, finding no support. He looked back at Bridget. Yes, Greco whispered, utterly defeated. The ports belong to the Morettis. Excellent, Bridget said, standing up and smoothing her navy dress. Dandre, I think we are finished here. I'd like to go home now. My feet are hurting. Within 6 months, the landscape of the city's underworld had been completely rewritten. The 5 families still existed in name, but in practice they answered to the Moretti Syndicate. There were no bloody street wars. There were no public assassinations. Enemies of the family simply received a black envelope containing their most damning, deeply buried secrets, along with a set of instructions. They either complied, or they vanished into the digital and physical ether. Don Carmine passed away in his sleep on a cold Tuesday in November. His funeral was a massive, ostentatious affair, attended by politicians, police chiefs, and mobsters alike. Dandra stood at the front, accepting their condolences, playing the role of the grieving, powerful heir. But behind the scenes, the true coronation had already happened. It was late in the evening on the day of the funeral. The Moretti estate was quiet, the last of the mourners having cleared out. Bridget was in Don Carmine's old study, which was now her study. She had redecorated it entirely. The heavy smoke-stained oak and hunting trophies had been replaced with sleek, modern monitors, soft velvet seating, and towering bookshelves filled with history, technology, and philosophy. She sat behind the desk wearing a comfortable cashmere sweater and loose trousers, reviewing a stream of data from the Nightingale network. The heavy oak doors opened, and Dandre walked in. He carried 2 glasses of expensive aged bourbon. He looked exhausted, but there was a new, strange light in his eyes as he looked at his wife. It was a mix of profound fear, absolute respect, and a dark, twisted infatuation. Power, he had learned, was far more intoxicating than physical beauty. He set a glass on her desk. "The mayor just called," Dandre said, taking a sip from his glass. "He agreed to fast-track the permits for our new legitimate shipping company. Greco signed over his union contacts this morning. We own the city, Bridget." "We stabilized the city, Dandre," Bridget corrected, without looking up from her screens. "Ownership is a liability. Control is an asset." Dandre walked around the desk, standing close to her chair. He reached out his hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before gently resting on her shoulder. It was the first time he had willingly touched her since the awkward, forced kiss at their wedding. "You did this," Dandre said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "You saved my life. You saved the family. I underestimated you. Everyone did. But I see you now. Now, Bridget. I truly see you." He leaned down, intending to kiss her. Bridget stopped typing. She didn't pull away, but she turned her head just enough so that his lips brushed the cold air near her cheek. Dandre froze, stepping back, a flash of hurt and confusion crossing his face. Bridget finally looked up at him. Her hazel eyes were calm, unreadable, and entirely devoid of the desperation for affection that most people harbored. "Dandre, we are excellent partners," Bridget said, her tone professional, like a CEO addressing a capable manager. "You play the face of this empire brilliantly. You command respect on the streets, and you execute the physical logistics flawlessly. We have built a dynasty." "But," Dandre asked, his voice tight, "but let us not confuse a hostile corporate takeover with a romance," she said softly. "You married an unwanted, chubby bride to pay off a debt. You despised me. You allowed your mistress to humiliate me. You allowed your family to threaten me. I did not dismantle this city's underworld to win your heart, Dandre. I did it because I was tired of being collateral damage in the games of lesser men." Dandre swallowed hard, the sting of her absolute truth piercing his ego. "Can things never change? Can I never earn your forgiveness? You have my protection, Dandre. You have my loyalty. You have half of $1 billion empire," Bridget said, turning her attention back to the glowing monitors. "Be satisfied with that. Because in this world, love is a vulnerability, and I do not tolerate vulnerabilities." Dandre looked at her for a long time. He realized then that he was completely trapped. He was the wealthiest, most feared Don on the East Coast, and he was nothing more than a well-paid employee to the woman sitting in front of him. "Understood," Dandre whispered. He turned and walked toward the heavy doors. Just before he left, he looked back. "Good night, boss." "Good night, Dandre," she replied. As the doors clicked shut, leaving Bridget alone in the quiet hum of the servers, she took a sip of the bourbon. She looked at the sprawling map of the city on her main monitor, every green dot representing an asset, every red dot representing a potential threat. The world had spent her entire life telling her she was too big, too quiet, too unwanted. They were right about one thing. She was too big. She was simply too big for the small, violent cages they had tried to put her in. The unwanted bride took another sip, her reflection glowing in the light of the monitors. She smiled, and in the shadows of the city, her enemies continued to disappear. What a twisted, dark ride into the underworld. Bridget Gallagher proved that silence isn't weakness. It's the ultimate weapon. If you were captivated by how the unwanted, chubby bride outsmarted the most dangerous men in the city without ever firing a single shot. Make sure you hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. Share this story with your friends who love mafia dramas, fierce revenge plots, and brilliant masterminds who turn the tables on their abusers. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more thrilling original stories just like this one. Who was your favorite character to see get their comeuppance? Let me know in the comments below.